Welcome to Sifting Through the Rubble here at Memorial Lutheran School, where we are working through the pedagogical principles for classical education that we've adopted as a school, looking at what does pedagogy, the way that we teach, what does it look like? And why does it look the way it does? What underlies it? So we have been going through, for the past few months now, a number of different principles. We've talked about the need to make haste slowly, festina lente, the need to focus on much and not many, multum non multa, decendo discimus, by teaching we learn, repetition is the mother of memory, repetitio mater memoriae, that the best teacher is a good book, optimus magister bonus liber. And the last 2 weeks, we looked at scholae, restful learning, and ecstasis and studium, or wonder and curiosity. Today, we reach the beginning of the home stretch. We have 2 weeks left going through these principles. Today, we will look at what it means to have embodied learning. As part of embodied learning, we'll talk about the need and the use of songs, chants, and jingles for the purpose of learning, but also what it means to be mindful of the fact that since God has created us with a body and a mind, or a soul, that we need to engage the body when it comes to educating. And that engaging the body involves all 5 senses. It involves many different ways. Sometimes this is called, say, styles of learning, but really, if we take seriously the fact of our existence, that we are created beings that have eyes and ears and a nose and a mouth, that we have fingers and we touch, that we taste and talk, then education should be embodied. It is not merely a thought-producing, provoking thing. So let's look at what it means to have an embodied education. Since God has made us body and soul, and one can also use the word mind, since God has made us this way, when we think about school and about educating, we should think that way. There's a temptation to be kind of Gnostic when it comes to education and to a lot of things. The Gnostics were 1st and 2nd century Christian heretics who focused all on the spirit and the spiritual, and for better or for worse, demonized matter and the body. And when we talk about education, there's always a tendency to focus on thought, and not always to remember that there's both body and mind, body and soul. The Enlightenment helped hasten and continue this, as the body and the mind were separated. This takes place when one analyzes philosophy, like with Descartes, and then it continues from there, where mind and body are separated, are distinguished one from another. And it is important then, even if sometimes it's good to separate your mind from your body and to think about things apart from acting, it's good to remember that you have both. You are not just one or the other. When Dr. Perrin goes through this part of his discussion of the principles of pedagogy, looking at embodied learning, he's really thinking about all the things that the body does and experiences. That the curriculum is not merely the books that we teach or even the subjects that we teach, but it's also the environment we find ourselves in, where we do the running, to use the pun, since curriculum comes from the Latin verb to run. Our faculty just finished yesterday studying a book called Beauty Matters by Steve Turley. And in this book, there's an argument made for a high aesthetic, that beauty and goodness and truth all need to be combined in the classical school. And in the second part of the book, he spends an awful lot of time talking about the different ways in which that high aesthetic is crafted through art and music, through spaces, internal, like classrooms, offices, and external, gardens, etc. And this is where the dovetail occurs between our discussion today of embodied learning and beauty. Where we learn can be as important as how and what we learn. The way the room looks, the way the room functions, the way the room engages or disengages the student, all of these are part of thinking about embodied learning, because we have bodies and our bodies react to the room around us. Our eyes are drawn to one book or another behind me as you're listening, if your eyes are open. When you're in a classroom, eyes can be drawn to the board where the teacher's working, or maybe to a poster on the wall, or maybe to something distracting out the window. Since we have bodies and minds, we need to take seriously the fact that both need to be engaged. Now, there are simple ways to do this. When we're practicing our math facts, or our Latin chants, or our jingles, or when we're reading, we can stand. We can get up out of our seat and we can stand. We can practice these things while we walk around outside, can help pass the time. If we're doing laps in PE, or say you're doing laps for discipline, reciting a Latin chant actually makes the lap go a whole lot faster. We found that out at cross-country practice a couple weeks ago. And when one does that, there's a video on YouTube through Scorpio Martianus. He's Luke Ranieri is his real name. He's a Latin enthusiast who also is in the military and loves to work out by counting. And when, say, you do push-ups and count to whatever number you'd like, or start at whatever number you'd like in Latin or any other language, it further ingrains that information in your head. And so there is some practical wisdom to recognizing that learning takes place with the body, because when you engage the other senses, when you engage both the mouth and the eyes and the ear, and even the scent, right, the nose and the tongue, and generally you're engaging the hands because you're writing, all of these pathways assist in the cementing of the knowledge in your head, in your being, as opposed to just what sometimes happens, right, in one ear and out the other. So how can we think about our school as a place that is embodied, not just a building where we send our children to furnish their minds with good thoughts and ways of thinking, but a place where their body and their mind or soul are cultivated and formed and inclined towards good, true, and beautiful things. One of the concrete ways that we do this at MLS is daily chapel. Daily chapel is embodied. We stand when we sing. We stand when we pray, since we don't have kneelers. We sit when we hear the word of God and receive the sermon. We fold our hands. Many make the sign of the cross. All of these are ways in which we use our bodies to express our faith and to remind ourselves where we are, that we are in the sanctuary, that we are receiving God's gifts. And when we are doing those things, there's a body and mind component. Lutheranism, in its most traditional form, has been very good about retaining the ceremonies of bowing and of hand folding and of making the sign of the cross. And all of those ceremonies are part and parcel to an embodied way of doing things. It isn't merely about your mind ascending to heaven when you are in the presence of God, receiving his gifts in the sanctuary. You have a body, and your body ought to be engaged doing things which keep the mind focused on the things of God. And so bowing at the Sanctus or at the name of Jesus or at any of the different times the church traditionally bows, keeping one's hands folded, making the sign of the cross, all of these things, standing, sitting, kneeling when one is able, all of these things assist in maintaining the embodiment that God intends, since we are created both with body and mind. Liturgy, practice, routine, all of these things assist in tying the body to the mind for the purpose of education. Goodness and beauty and truth, they all are not just abstract things that float around that we talk about, but we can see them. We can smell and taste and touch good things, beautiful things. And so by modeling this for our children, by thinking of ways that our schools can engage this way, we are furthering their education, certainly, but driving deeper connections for them as they are educated. C.S. Lewis, in Abolition of Man, which we've referenced a lot here, makes a big deal about the different organs that man uses for the purpose of thinking and feeling. Without a chest, man does not have the ability to receive the lovely things. If we focus strictly on the mind, or even on the hand, and don't also focus on developing the loves of the student, then, as Lewis says, we produce men without chests. Boys and girls all need chests in that figurative sense, just as they need minds and hands. The scriptures are full of language that deals with the mind and with the gut, or the heart, depending on where you want to seat your emotions, and with the hands, that we love our neighbors in thought, that we love them in deed and in words, which come from a heart, not the sinful and heart from which pours all sorts of unclean things, but the heart that is the clean heart, that is the new heart, that has been placed there by God through the work of the Holy Spirit, that is filled with the things of Jesus. The mind, heart, and hands then work in the Christian student for the purpose of the neighbor. So as we look at what it means to embody learning, we think about using our bodies, about standing, walking, sitting, hands, eyes, nose, mouth, ears. One very clear way of doing this is songs, chants, and jingles. And the benefit of this, of course, is that many of the songs that are used in education, are used in our school, have an earworm quality. When we start singing those things over and over and over again, they cannot escape. They burrow deeper and deeper into the mind and form very significant pathways that then constitute firm memories that aren't going anywhere. Chapel is another good example of this, because in chapel, we have a number of students, kindergarten and sometimes first grade, all the way on down, who can't read. At least not yet anyway. Towards the end of the year or the middle of the year, depending on the grade, they have the ability to read. But by being in chapel and singing the liturgy, hearing the liturgy every single day, seeing it in the mouths and actions of all the fellow classmates and of the pastor up front and of the teachers, hearing the baptismal font, smelling the incense when sometimes that is burned. All of these things implant memories in the children, and the children memorize the service. They can sing the liturgy without having to be able to read. That is an example of embodied learning. Christians are good at that. But oftentimes, there's some sort of a wall that divides, even if we have great things in the sanctuary, divides those things, those embodied ways of receiving God's gifts, from embodied ways of learning in the class, of engaging all the senses, of treating the student as a whole person, a body and a mind. Songs, chants, and jingles certainly are one way of doing that. Standing up, talking through, singing through. Great examples of this in our curriculum are the states songs. The northern border of the United States, the northern border of the United States, Washington and Idaho, Montana, right? And it goes all the way, I'll go for you, all the way across the northern border. And usually there's a map in front of them, and they're pointing as they're singing, as they're listening, and they're seeing all the states. That is embodied learning. When we're going through the paradigms, the declensions and the conjugations for the sake of Latin, I, arm, is, as, is. Rhythm assists. We also use CDs from Classical Academic Press for the little kids, from the sing-song Latin, or whatever it's called. And those are really great little jingles. Our students, probably more than both of those, appreciate the Shirley jingles. And some of them are not that easy to sing, but they know how to sing them. They've learned them by heart, and they can sing all there is to sing about objects of prepositions and sentences and subjects and predicates, and they love it. They rejoice to stand up and dance and sing to all of the Shirley jingles, all the way up to 5th grade. I wouldn't be surprised if some 6th graders also wouldn't appreciate every once in a while listening to the Shirley jingles. And that therein is the point, that embodied learning produces wonder. Embodied learning increases eagerness and curiosity, engaging all of the senses of the student on a fairly regular basis, enables the student to receive what is being taught and retain what is being taught and enjoy what is being taught. Think of all the different times you've eaten things in class or smelled things when you were a student, and how those lessons left indelible marks, right? Marks in your memory that you can't rub out. Imagine if all of life, in terms of education, was treated with such seriousness with regards to being embodied, with caring for the interaction of all the senses. In many ways, it's being done in our classes from preschool all the way up, but being aware of how useful it is for the purpose of education, and not just useful in the utilitarian sense, but being aware that learning is more than just taking care of the mind, awakens children to a new sense of wonder, to a new sense of curiosity and enjoyment as they learn. All right, there's about 10 minutes left here. I have more I can say, if necessary, with regards to cultivating beauty for the sake of the senses, as well as things on songs, chants, and jingles, but I'm happy to open it up and allow for conversation or questions, curiosity in the positive sense. You can unmute yourself if you're interested, and if not, then I can always wax more, but I've been waxing for a little while. Any concerns or interesting things or additions you'd like to make?
It's very good, Pastor Paul. You had a lot to say, and it's all very helpful.
Thanks.
it's very helpful to hear about the different settings and the environments. You talked about the environment, but that for different types of learning and different activities, there are different settings that lend themselves better, singing versus walking versus eating. And it's the difference between memorizing, which is important, and also discussing, which is a different activity. Like we have different activities. It's good to see the order to it and how that order helps the embodied learning as opposed to just a cacophony, which maybe sometimes has its place just for that type of like recess type
Mhm.
of, but we have different settings for our bodily needs. We have different settings for our learning needs. It was very interesting to hear you kind of go through a lot of that.
Yeah, I think it is important um, that setting matters because setting prepares you to think one way or another. It also sets you up for success or failure. Um,
Mhm.
Although not all settings are created equal and not all families do things the same way. Um, when you talk to people who homeschool, if they don't have any way in which they've set apart space, right, um, homeschooling can be kind of difficult because there's no setting in which to say, I'm doing this now, not something else. And by convention, we set apart rooms in our houses for specific things, right? We don't tend to, at least traditionally, eat in the bedroom. We sleep in the bedroom. We eat in the kitchen or the dining room. We sit and so here, right, at school, we have the sanctuary, which is specifically and chiefly for the receiving of God's gifts. And we have the classroom, which this year, because of COVID, is the place where everything happens. But generally speaking, is a place where certain kinds of learning take place. Um, I know that third grade had a picnic yesterday, so they ate outside. And there are some schools, St. Paul Hamel has an outdoor classroom. And I don't think it's really chairs and desks or an outdoor classroom, but they go outside for a long period of time. And that there's so many ways in which progressive education tries to think outside the box, which is harmful to education, without realizing that the box is pretty big already. If we engage the senses and think about setting and think about using the body and be aware of that, then the box is really only as small as we make it. It's a self-imposed box. So yeah, I
There are
think
many things are beneficial. Not all have to be essential, but
yes, absolutely,
it
absolutely.
also reminds me of the school uniforms. Is that another example of?
Yeah, uniforms are an example of embodied learning. That because the body is sort of restrained for the purposes of receiving information, that when I go to school, I dress a certain way because I'm going to be doing certain things. And when I am home, I can dress another way because I'm not doing certain things. And I mean, although custom has changed in a lot of places, church clothes still exist, at least at Memorial, where we dress a certain way for church. And that prepares us to act and think a certain way in the sanctuary. It isn't merely to do one's best, it is to incline the mind and the body to remember what you're doing on a Sunday. On Sunday morning, when you're dressed a certain way, it's because you are going to be receiving God's gifts. And yes, God would be fine if you showed up in your pajamas, technically. Right. Nobody got smitten, except for the priests. If a priest showed up in his pajamas in the Old Testament, he'd be dead. But the people of Israel, right, weren't given a dress code. They were given, you couldn't have more than one fiber, so polyester pajamas wouldn't work. But if you wore all cotton, right? That would be fine. However, we don't do that because we know and we intuit also that there's a certain way one dresses in the presence of God. And it inclines one to act a certain way in the presence of God and to think a certain way in the presence of God. So on Sunday, we dress a certain way for church. And then usually because mom tells us to change, we change back into our play clothes instead of getting our church clothes dirty when we go play outside. Likewise, like you said, at school, uniforms are helpful because they incline one to think about being in school. That I'm here to be respecting my teacher and my peers, and I'm here to be receiving information. And that is different from Saturday or the afternoon after school is out, or summer break or Christmas break, when all sorts of clothes are permissible because there I'm just being a child at home. I'm not in the vocation of student sitting in the classroom. But yeah, I think, and I include myself in my audience to whom we should be thinking about setting and senses. It's easy to forget. It's odd that we forget because we're sitting in it all the time. But it's easy to forget that the body needs to be engaged and that engaging the body educates better. When the little kids do the hand motions for all their songs, right? They remember and they love it. And over time they fade out. But these are the Holy 10 Commands is cemented in the minds of many children because they also have hand motions. There's a lot of ways in which that works. And I have kids who to this day remind me of the chicken Lombard pasties that I made for them when I subbed for history a couple years ago here, because when they ate, right, when they eat, they remember. It engages the body, not just the mind through the ear. Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
I thought of one more thought that just occurred to me as listening to these things that you're saying, and that is also there seems to be a care and parental aspect of this embodied learning. Things like the sugar intake needs to be controlled, both for the good of the child and for the learning to take place, and
Sure,
other
I think
physical examples.
if we take seriously the stewardship of the body, then eating in a way that takes care of the body, which can, right, we don't have to go the Michelle Obama route in order to care for the body. But we can be reasonable, right? That we don't just tell all the parents to pack donuts for snack, but instead try and pack things that serve as adequate fuel for learning.
Yeah, I can think of many ways that children are just not inclined toward taking care of their bodies. And then we teach them how to take care of their bodies.
Yeah. Very good. Well, that was a fast half hour. Next week is the last of the principles, which is the virtues of education. We'll take a look at love, humility, diligence, and constancy as 4 of them. And maybe we'll talk about virtue in general, where the word comes from, how people have thought about virtue, and then look and see, how we can cultivate virtue in the classroom and in the school, and what the purpose of doing that is. Since oftentimes virtue historically has stood at odds with Christian living, at least the historic virtues, since virtues were about bettering the person, and Christian virtue tends to be about emptying the person and humbling the person. So I'll leave that as the appetizer to satisfy the body and the soul next time when we meet next Friday to talk about virtue in education. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll post this one up on YouTube and see you next week.
Thank you, Pastor Paul.
You're welcome.